All right, this should be the second video in week 3. We're working through Longenecker, and yeah, there's so much in here, things that don't take into consideration um, what we've been studying about oral traditional cultures, media studies. And as we get into move into this book that's more recent, I think you'll see some of the same things. Is There's just not a consideration of how um, non-Western traditional cultures communicate and use um, their data, their traditions. So, what I'm going to try to do here is, I am, I have not gone through every verse that Longenecker discusses, or that Moise is going to go over. What I'm going to try to do is give you snippets of my approach that admittedly may be anecdotal, because I'm giving you snippets of one or two things out of this guy's life work, second edition, that he's put together. I'm going to show you a couple of pieces of where I think he missed it out of the 200 and something pages that we're going to be reading. So I just want to give that caveat. I understand that some of my critiques or some of the data I present may be anecdotal, because I'm giving you one example as opposed to these overviews of the entire Bible that these people are looking at. However, I also think that these pieces are important. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to look at Matthew 4, and this take that Longenecker presents very briefly, admittedly, because he's trying to go over basically the entire scripture, but this little piece he gives on the quotation about quoting Isaiah 9 of Zebulun and Naphtali sitting in darkness and seeing the great light. So in a previous video, we looked at the distinction that Longenecker draws from Michael Fishbane between the traditum and the traditio. Remember that? And we engage those terms by seeing the traditum as like the received textual material, the text itself that we're reading, the words, the images, and forms that have been handed down. And then we talked about the traditio kind of as the interpretive tradition behind the text, behind that performance, the living world of meaning that teaches a community how those words, images, and forms are supposed to be heard. Now, I hope as we've been digging into oral traditional cultures, I hope that we can see that more realistically, we might say that the traditio is the full tradition as it exists in the hearts and minds of the community. And the traditum, this text that we're talking about, is just one performance of the greater traditio. That there's this great tradition that is shared in the hearts and minds of the community, and a performance steps into this traditional world and performs a piece of this tradition from within the tradition, maybe expanding the tradition a little bit, or making a specific point, but it's the traditio doesn't stand out. It's not like here's the traditum, the text, and the traditio is above it or below it. It's the traditum itself is a part of it. It's within that greater tradition. I hope that makes sense. It's the traditio that gives any traditum its shape. If the traditum, if the text is true to the tradition, then it's that tradition that gives it its shape, and that traditio is required for a proper interpretation. So that's why when we study the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, I don't think we can only ask, did the author quote the text accurately? Or did the author change the wording for his theological emphasis? Those questions matter, but they're not enough. Those questions are questions we ask from our Western individualistic post-Gutenberg text-saturated tradition, but we need to process through these oral traditional non-Western cultures, so we can also ask what traditional field is being activated by the way the passage is being performed. So with that in mind, let's look at Longenecker's brief treatment of Matthew 4:15 through 16. Matthew quotes Isaiah 9, 1 through 2, the promise that the light will dawn in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, Galilee of the Gentiles. And as we see in Longenecker, Matthew does not simply reproduce either the Hebrew text or the Septuagint exactly. Longenecker notices that Matthew's wording differs. In particular, Matthew emphasizes the people as sitting or dwelling in darkness, and he shifts the promise into the context of fulfillment in Jesus's ministry. So here's Matthew 4:16. The big thing that we're focusing on is this piece right here. Hakathemenos in skate and tois kathemenois in kora kai skia thanatu. When you look up here how Isaiah 9:1 reads in Ralph's Septuagint, Ralph's reconstruction of the Septuagint, you see that the way it reads there is this word instead, ha paru amenas in skate instead of kathemenos. You see that? Two different words. And then here it's katoikuntes in kora kaiskia thanatu. But again, the same word is used here. So Matthew changed both of these words to be from the same root, the same word of sitting and dwelling instead of walking and dwelling. So sitting instead of walking and dwelling, sitting and sitting instead of walking and dwelling. So Longenecker's explanation is that Matthew's changes are theological, typological, and even almost Pesher-like. Jesus' ministry in Galilee becomes the this that fulfills that of Isaiah's promise. Now, I think that an oral traditional approach helps us dig deeper. Longenecker has identified the phenomenon. Matthew altered the wording, and the alteration is theologically motivated. But oral traditional theory helps us ask about the mechanism. Why did Matthew alter the wording this particular way? In other words, the question is not simply, did Matthew have the freedom to handle Isaiah in a fluid way, something resembling a Pesher-like or typological approach? The question is, what was that freedom for? Or how is that freedom utilized? What's the freedom all about? What does it point to? My argument is that Matthew's freedom is not merely freedom to adjust the wording of Isaiah to fit his version of Jesus' context. Matthew had the freedom and ability to perform Isaiah's tradition in a way that activated other streams of Isaiah's traditio and traditum around Jesus. Matthew doesn't just have the freedom to produce his own theology. Matthew has a freedom from within that greater tradition, from within that traditio, to choose other traditums in that traditio in such a way to activate those for rhetorical purposes. to get his point across. So we looked at the wording already. We saw how Isaiah 9 speaks of the people who walked in darkness, seeing a great light. The Hebrew text also speaks of those dwelling in the land of the shadow of death. We looked at that Greek a second ago. The Septuagint speaks of the people walking in darkness and those dwelling in the region of the shadow of death. But Matthew reshapes the wording so the key posture becomes sitting. Both of those words are shifted to sitting. The people sitting in darkness have seen a great light, and those sitting in the land and shadow of death, a light has dawned. The repeated language of sitting in darkness is the clue, and this is where an oral traditional approach changes the way we investigate the text. If I'm expecting the biblical tradition bearers, to operate like modern writers using footnotes, then I may simply say Matthew changed the wording. And maybe I'll ask whether he did so because of a different manuscript family he had in front of him, or maybe he wanted to adapt Isaiah to his own theological situation. Those questions are fine, probably legitimate questions. But if I'm expecting an oral traditional culture where phrases can activate larger fields of shared memory, then I ask a different question. Maybe I ask, where else does the tradition speak this way? Where else do we find people sitting in darkness? Why is Matthew doubling down, so to speak, on this sitting in darkness phraseology? When we ask that question, we find Psalm 107. Psalm 107 describes people sitting in darkness and the shadow of death. Psalm 107, you can see people sitting in darkness and in the shadow of death, skia thanatu. And they're bound in affliction and iron. So these are not simply people having a gloomy day. They're prisoners. They're captives. They're helpless. They're sitting bound in affliction and iron, sitting in death, darkness, no hope unless God rescues them, breaks their chains, and brings them out. So Matthew's wording does not merely say Jesus moved into the region Isaiah named. It says more than that. It makes Isaiah 9 sound like Psalm 107. The light dawning in Galilee is now heard reverberating even more loudly in relation to captivity, exile, chains, helplessness, and divine deliverance. And the activation doesn't stop there. There's another place in the Old Testament that speaks of people sitting in darkness, a place also found in Isaiah. Isaiah 42 introduces the servant of the Lord. The servant is given as a covenant for the people and a light to the nations. He opens blind eyes. He brings prisoners out from the dungeon. He brings out those who sit in darkness. Matthew's gospel later quotes Isaiah 42 explicitly in Matthew chapter 12 and applies the servant passage to Jesus. So Isaiah 42, it's not just some random text that we're importing into Matthew from the outside. Matthew himself shows us that the servant tradition belongs to his understanding of Jesus. So when Matthew reshapes Isaiah 9 as he quotes it around people sitting in darkness, the connection is not merely a verbal or part of some kind of personal typological Pesher shift in Matthew for his own theological innovations. This connection is already living inside this traditio, this biosphere, this circumambient tradition. Matthew just performs the tradition in a way that manifests how the context is aligned. Isaiah 9 gives us Galilee, darkness, Assyrian exile of the northern Gentile regions, and the dawning of light. Psalm 107 gives us prisoners sitting in darkness and the shadow of death, helplessly awaiting God's rescue. Isaiah 42 gives us the servant as light to the nations, opening blind eyes. And liberating those who sit in darkness. And Matthew brings these streams of tradition together around Jesus. So this is why I would describe Matthew's use of Isaiah 9 not merely as textual deviation or personal innovative typological Pesher-like interpretation, but as traditional activation. Matthew is performing Isaiah in such a way that Psalm 107 and Isaiah 42 are heard with it. Longenecker's categories are not useless at all. They're helpful. He's right to speak of typology. I mean, the traditional community expected the same God to operate in the same ways in different generations. We can see echoes of God's activity. Longenecker is right to recognize there's the Pesher-like application. He's right to see that the New Testament authors have this corporate solidarity, this messianic focus, that they're starting from their experience of Jesus, but they're not just starting from their experience with Jesus ex nihilo, out of nowhere, out of nothing. They're experiencing the Jewish Messiah from within this circumambient tradition. And so they are theologically motivated, but they're not shoving something into the tradition. They're experiencing something from within the tradition. It's one thing to say Matthew utilized his freedom to alter the text in a unique and personal way. But it's another thing to say Matthew's altered wording was a performance from within a biosphere of meaning, and that performance activated a broader traditional field, a broader understanding of communal identity. And that difference matters, because in an oral traditional world, freedom with wording does not necessarily mean freedom from the tradition. It means freedom from within the tradition for the purpose of highlighting traditional identity markers for the community to walk in. The tradiant can reshape the performance precisely because he or she knows the tradition well enough to activate it faithfully. So in Matthew 4, we're seeing how Matthew's performance of Isaiah 9 activates the greater tradition, the wider darkness and deliverance tradition of Isaiah's scriptures. So as we study the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, we're learning to listen for how scripture was remembered, received, activated, and performed inside living communities. That doesn't mean that every verbal similarity proves an intentional connection. It does not mean that we can speculate freely. Longenecker's concern for controls still matter. We should still ask, is there verbal overlap? Is there thematic coherence? Is there density? Is there a pattern elsewhere in the author's work? Is the proposed connection something the broader traditional world could plausibly hear? And in Matthew 4, those controls are strong. There's verbal overlap in sitting in darkness, a phrase that Matthew intentionally double shifts the traditum toward. There's thematic coherence of darkness, exile, captivity, death, Gentiles, light, rescue, salvation, deep need of God to do for people what they cannot do for themselves. There's contextual fit with Matthew's gospel, especially Matthew's later use of Isaiah 42. And there is theological coherence with Matthew's presentation of Jesus as the one who brings Israel's story to fulfillment. So this is an observation of the natural methods of oral traditional communication. So if I only read Matthew 4 as a general fulfillment of a modified version of Isaiah 9, then yeah, I can say Jesus moved into Galilee as a light to people in the darkness without him and fulfilled that prophecy. And that's true, but it's just a little thinner than what Matthew's really saying. If I read Matthew's wording as traditional activation, then the interpretive field opens up. Jesus is not merely arriving at the right location. He's entering the darkness of Israel's devastated and exiled story. He's coming to people who are not just confused, but captive, sitting in the darkness, chained to the floor in helplessness, not just wandering, but shackled down, not just lacking information, but bound in chains in death, darkness, helpless until God acts. Psalm 107 helps us hear the utter helplessness of the people sitting in darkness. Isaiah 42 helps us identify the one who comes to them, the servant who is the light to the nations, who opens blind eyes and who brings prisoners out of the dungeon. The passage is not merely asking us to admire Matthew's clever use of Isaiah. It's inviting us to recognize ourselves within the same traditional identity. We are the people who cannot generate our own light. Well, first, the people in Galilee were chained to the darkness just as much as people captive in Assyria or Babylon. And so Matthew is saying, this is who we are. And now we, reading Matthew's testimony to the tradition, we say, we too are like those who were in Galilee that Jesus moved to. We too are like those Israelites bound in chains in exile, separated from our home, separated from our family, separated from our God. We are chained in darkness and we need Jesus. So even though we live in a different cultural world, these activated traditions still teach us how to inhabit the traditions of our ancient faith communities. They teach us to receive Jesus not merely as a teacher who gives guidance, but as the light who enters our captivity, breaks our chains, activates the eschatological promises of Israel and the nations, and forms us into a community of deliverance. Yeah. So the payoff of oral traditional interpretation is not just that it gives us a more interesting intertextual reading, it helps us hear the traditional emphases that shape the community's identity so that we can step into that identity faithfully in our own context as an extension of that community. Longenecker helps us see that Matthew uses the Old Testament with theological and typological freedom. An oral traditional approach helps us see what that freedom can actually do. So I wonder, some of these other really crazy random pieces that Matthew seems to use about how he, out of Egypt, I called my son. Is Matthew really saying this text had no context in its original place in our history? It was actually talking about Jesus. Or when Matthew says that and says it's fulfilled, is Matthew just activating in the hearts and minds of the people the story, that whole epic, right? I can say this one phrase and the whole epic is there. So suddenly Jesus is the one who's going to fulfill the Exodus promises. Is Matthew saying this was actually a future prophecy about Jesus, or is Matthew saying all of that story is fulfilled in Jesus? And I'm taking this time of talking about Jesus coming out of Egypt to say that, hey, he's the fulfillment of us coming out of Egypt. You know, is Matthew making this Western logical positivistic statement that this is a fulfilled prophecy in the way we understand prophecy, or is Matthew saying, hey, this is us, which is kind of Pesher, this is that, but it's a Pesher baptized in traditional identity. Yeah. So that's the movement from just seeing these as a deviation on Matthew's part to see them as activation on Matthew's part. And that's one of the major contributions of an oral traditional approach to the study of the New Testament's use of the Old Testament.